Okay, hello all. Good afternoon. I'm Carla Millett. I'm director of the Center for European Studies. And I wanted to just a couple of little pieces of business before we get underway. I wanted to announce our upcoming lectures from the Center for European Studies. Tomorrow we're going to have, no wait, this is not tomorrow. What is tomorrow? Tomorrow is this lecture. It's actually a WCED lecture that we are co-sponsoring. Stathis Kalivas is going to give a lecture called Greece and the Eurozone, Where To? That's tomorrow here at 4 p.m. Wednesday, February 10th, so day after tomorrow, Neringa, I did not learn the pronunciations of these names. Neringa, do you know how to pronounce her name? Klumbite? Okay. Anyway, here at noon, she'll be giving a lecture for CREASE, Russian East European Eurasian Studies, called Of Secrecy and Laughter, Aesthetics, Governance, and the Covert Sphere in Soviet Lithuania. The next CES lecture happens on March 24th, when Saime Ozjurumes will speak on refugees and healthcare policies. How does Europe cope? And then the other piece of business that my other happy responsibility before we begin is to acknowledge the co-sponsorship of SEMENAS, Middle East and North African Studies, and WCED, the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, for this lecture. Now, it's my deep pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Maurizio Albahri. Maurizio received his BA from the Università degli Studi di Florence in Italy in 2000. He got an MA and PhD at UC Irvine in anthropology in 2006. He's held research fellowships at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego and at the Erasmus Institute at Notre Dame. He is at Notre Dame now. He's assistant professor of anthropology, also a fellow at the Nanovich Institute for European Studies, and he's a faculty affiliate with Italian Studies and the Center for Civil and Human Rights. Maurizio's work is situated sort of at the intersection of scholarship and public citizenship. He is an active and a vocal participant in debates around migration, around international human rights, around the unfolding migration crisis across the Mediterranean. His first book, which just came out, is called Crimes of Peace, Mediterranean Migrations at the World's Deadliest Border. Penn Press published the book in 2015. The book focuses on the harrowing history of migrants' passage across the Mediterranean. For those of us who study Mediterranean history, this is an old story and a dreary story. The geopolitical disputes, the confessional and religious disputes, the ethnic disputes and conflicts that drive populations from one shore to another across the Mediterranean. Maurizio is interested in the most recent iteration of this crisis, the one that is unfolding today. Migrants and refugees who aim for European shores, who cross paths with smugglers, fishermen, diplomats, priests, bureaucrats, armed forces, sailors. It seems pretty much everybody who lives within 30 miles of the Mediterranean shore. Who is responsible for these spaces that belong to all and to no one, and for people trapped in these borderlands, in these interstices between states? Maurizio brings the sensibility and the toolkit of an anthropologist to answering this question, to untangling this question, and really at the heart and the moral compass of a human being, which is one of the things that makes the book so beautiful and such an important achievement. Here it is. The Times Literary Supplement called it indispensable. It's a gripping read. It's fastidiously researched, all the more powerful for the empathy and the moral engagement with which Maurizio approaches the people whose lives he's describing in its pages. The title of his talk is Cutting Water with a Knife, Refugees and Europe's Mediterranean Question. Please join me in welcoming Maurizio Albahri.
Good afternoon. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Center for European Studies, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and every faculty and staff member who has made possible this visit, particularly Carla Mallet. Also, thank you for your kind introduction, and Zana Kaiser, colleagues and graduate students in anthropology, Italian and Romance languages and literatures, and all of you for being here tonight. And please forgive me if I'm forgetting anyone. It's not that we crossed a border, it is the border that crossed us. So it's not that we crossed a border, it's the border that crossed us. Abdul, a Tunisian college student, used this phrase to capture his migratory journey following the 2011 Tunisian uprisings from coastal Tunisia to the southern Italian island of Lampedusa, which is actually closer to Tunisia than to the rest of Italy, the island of Lampedusa. And that's Lampedusa. The Euro-Mediterranean border threshold I explored today is not spatially bound. It is not a static and confined space. It extends across heavily patrolled and virtually fenced Mediterranean straits and into holding facilities in the urban peripheries of the European Union and of its neighbors. It has material, legal, and symbolic qualities. It migrates from the mass graves at the bottom of the sea into the identitarian trenches of national public spheres. We might speak of a diffuse border, and it is in the sense that the border migrates. It crosses and envelopes people, as Abdul puts it, rather than the other way around. And quite interestingly, I know similar expressions as the border kind of crossing us are used by Central American migrants in this country. But this awareness or this analysis does not deny the motivation and what I call usually structured agency of people like Abdul, of Moroccan Abderrazak Mahmoudi, also in the book, or Afghan Ali, another story and person, real person in the book. These people survived the long journey across exploitative times, criminal spaces, sovereign containment, economic systems, cultural styles, and legal regulations, generally defined with a shorthand, with a shortcut, migration. Trajectories are often fragmented, and time might seem suspended. People battle EU and bilateral agreements that outsource immigration management and shift southward sovereign boundaries. As stowaways, they wrap themselves in aluminum foil to avoid detection in European ports. Their bodies are traversed by X-ray to assess age. Their phenotype becomes an indicator, supposedly, of their country of origin. Wrinkles and expression lines cross their faces. Their life is traversed by the transgenerational stress of maritime crossing and of undocumented status. They breathe gasoline. Drops of it are added to water, so they drink less and become delusional. Their skin is burned by the fuel. Bodies at sea are slick and even more difficult to pull on board. Hunger, thirst, self-mutilation, and preventable disease are a tangible reality in the Mediterranean. What is the Mediterranean? This is Malta. It's a sea of languages, and to borrow from Carla's work, it's a sea of languages where complexity and directionality cannot easily be captured by Orientalist vintage points. And it's water, salt, straits, ports, trade, vessels, cities, relations, fiber optics, beauty, refineries, olive trees, sanctuary, shipwrecks, and historical memory. This fluid list could be much longer, especially given the horrific conflicts currently binding and lacerating Mediterranean lands. And among the newest geopolitical actors, we must include the enthusiasts of the pseudo-caliphate, who know perfectly well the strategic and logistic importance of a Mediterranean access, in Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, and Lebanon. The Mediterranean is all of this. There is no doubt, however, that the Mediterranean Sea is also the world's deadliest international border, especially in its central stretch between Libya and Italy. Not sure if you can read it. It reads extracomunitarian. There's also kind of a typo in Italian. It means non-EU migrant, and this is in Lampedusa, kind of 2008. A reminder for those of us who are not particularly knowledgeable about this, that this has been going on for many, many years. But at least, this person found a burial site. And of course, I'm happy to address any of these, to talk more about any of these pictures in the Q&A. This is part of the, in Italian, the Cimitero delle Barche, the boats cemetery, also on the island of Lampedusa, and there are hundreds of boats there. Zuara is a Libyan port city not far from the Tunisian border, so in Libya, and it serves as a migrant smuggling hub. It promises arrival to Lampedusa 180 miles to the north. Lampedusa's fishermen avoid the stretch of sea to the island south, so between Lampedusa and Zuara, Libya. Experience tells them their fishing nets are likely to be torn by the many wrecks on the seabed. And in Zuara, many residents stay away from the wild-caught fish. They are afraid if the fish feed off human flesh. 2015 was the deadliest year on record for Mediterranean migrations, with 3,771 persons who died or went missing at sea. Observers had to deploy the exact same phrase in 2014 and in 2011, before that. And if anyone is interested, later I can I can share the link to this. It's UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. Here, among other things, you can see this graph with the dead and missing persons at sea. So, 2011, 2014, 2015. This year, as of early February, well, I checked this yesterday night. It was 366 casualties. That's what I wrote down. Today, it's 391 people who died or are missing at sea. Over 2 decades, the making and perpetuation of the Mediterranean as a mass grave has been witnessed by local citizens, by lawyers, by prosecutors, by journalists, by policymakers, fishermen, military personnel, and humanitarian workers around coastal locations, but also at sea itself, in the interstices between sovereign spaces and jurisdictions, and in government and parliament buildings or venues far from the sea. In my book, I have addressed the specific actors, casualties, casualties, and concatenations involved in what I call the empirical offenses of structural injustice, crimes of peace. It does take many pages to argue that these are crimes of peace, and to support an argument that is and needs to be factually, empirically grounded, rather than merely or simply a moral plea. So I want to do something else here today. For more than 2 decades, Italy has been blamed as the EU soft underbelly and immigration magnet for its perceived inability to deter and detect undocumented immigration. Italian and EU authorities, in turn, have consistently emphasized that Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, Egypt, Albania, Montenegro, and Turkey need to do their part in patrolling their maritime borders. Every country on the Western Balkan route, so Macedonia, which you can actually see here, Macedonia, Serbia, Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia, Austria, all the way to Germany, France, Denmark, Sweden, and the UK, would like their respective southern neighbor to do more in stemming the flow, the so-called flow of refugees. A couple of weeks ago, we heard paradigmatic remarks by the Austrian Interior Minister saying it is a myth that the Greek-Turkish border can't be protected, as the Greek Navy has sufficient capacity to keep refugees out. EU Border Patrol head Fabrice Leggeri, grappling with the fact that, quoting, despite the bad weather, between 2,000 and 3,000 people are arriving in Greece each day, is of the opinion that, quoting, Turkey has to make it more difficult for the migrant smugglers, which is essentially a euphemism, a politically correct way to make the case for Syrian refugees containment within Turkey. The consequences of what is perceived as the Italian, Greek, and Turkish bureaucratic inadequacy and also moral failure are being represented as fatal. Without securing the EU's external borders, the unrestricted mobility of goods and people within the EU cannot be guaranteed. The idea and practice of Europe would die, we are hearing. But what is this idea of Europe? These are the questions I'd like to discuss with you today. Are we witnessing yet another mechanism for Europe, whatever we mean by that, to expunge the Mediterranean from within itself, to produce itself as continentally self-sufficient through boundary demarcation? Which Europe? What is the idea and practice of Europe emerging from this European refugee crisis? Or is it a Mediterranean refugee crisis? Middle Eastern? Should we even call it a crisis? And this is the main square in Lampedusa, where they are a little bit skeptical about the European Union. We know what happened in Libya in recent months. To governments, or no government, dozens of militias, an active terrorist presence, mostly non-Libyan. Maritime migration to Italy from Libya continues to happen in large numbers, but it involves fewer Syrians than in the recent past. Egypt, following the, let's call it, government change in the summer of 2013, introduced the need for visas and security clearance for Syrians. Additionally, in March 2015, Algeria, from where people would enter Libya, also introduced visas for Syrians. The violence in Libya, the difficulty of reaching its neighboring countries, and the correct perception of the lethality of the central Mediterranean route help account for the shift to the Aegean migration route for Syrian refugees in particular. So this route here. Turkey has become the world's top recipient of refugees, with at least 2.2 million Syrians, plus another 300,000 people from countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, and Iran. Turkey closed official border crossing points to almost all Syrians in early March 2015. They were open only to aid trucks, traders, injured Syrians, and Syrians registered in Turkey who are given special permission to visit Syria. It is common knowledge among Syrians that the country can be entered only using smugglers, especially following stepped-up enforcement measures at unofficial border crossing points after the July 20 terrorist attacks in Turkey. Even using smugglers, essentially the only route runs to the southeast of Antakya in Turkey. The hilly terrain makes it harder there for Turkish authorities to detect people. Also, Turkey introduced a requirement in January that Syrians coming from third states such as Jordan or Lebanon must have a visa to enter Turkey. As I explain in Crimes of Peace, there are fundamental empirical faults in the abstract idea that Turkish maritime patrols, as well as their Greek, Egyptian, Libyan, Tunisian, Italian colleagues at sea, can somehow safely, humanely, and without the use of force, deter, dissuade and reroute European Union-bound migrant boats. Still, between January and October 2015, the Turkish Coast Guard intercepted some 60,000 people in the Aegean, actively preventing them from reaching Greek islands. In August 2015, the mayor of Izmir established checkpoints at the city's entrance in order to identify Syrian refugees intending to leave Turkey. Some of the people apprehended on the coast and close to the land borders with Greece and Bulgaria are detained, including in centers financed by the European Union, and repatriated, even to Syria. Over the last few days, thousands of people, probably you've seen this in the news, thousands of people living behind Aleppo's bombardment have been stranded at the border with Turkey, with top EU officials emphasizing that the country, Turkey, needs to keep its doors open to refugees. That's what European Union officials are saying. But the same officials would like Turkey to keep those refugees in the very moment they enter. Many refugees do intend to return to their homes at some point. And I have heard for many young Syrians who are eager to engage in national rebuilding. Undeniably, though, the hope is dwindling. Even the Turkish government, which back in 2011 might have anticipated that the Syrian government's fall, Bashar Assad's fall, would be a matter of months, is coming to terms with the reality of Syrian refugees' long-term presence. For example, with new legislation finally allowing, in a very limited manner, Syrian labor. As recently put by the Family and Social Policies Minister of Turkey, the 150,000 babies born to Syrian families last year alone are Turkish babies. So there's finally this idea that, okay, Syrian refugees are here to stay. About 3 billion euros have been pledged by the EU toward improving the situation of Syrian refugees registered in Turkish camps, but 90% among Syrian refugees live outside government-run refugee camps, and it would be a challenge to assist them. While this aid is urgent and necessary, the EU's motives are not a secret. Turkey is expected to contain refugees' mobility across the Aegean. In response, Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu recently declared that his country is not a concentration camp and will not host refugees indefinitely just to appease the EU. Indeed, the unprecedented arrival of Syrian refugees has only recently contributed to the EU's appreciation of the fundamental role of countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iran in hosting refugees. Macedonia, Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia have intermittently allowed and occasionally facilitated the transit of refugees surviving the crossing into Turkey and across the Aegean. In November, though, several men who are not Syrians or Afghanis or Iraqis were kind of stranded at the Greek-Macedonian border and, for example, stood their lips shut in protest because these countries are allowing the transit of essentially Afghanis, Iraqis, and Syrians. At all these borders in southeastern Europe, there have been examples of clashes with the police, of people being stranded, of lack of essential services, of the erection of a variety of fences, most famously or infamously in the case of Hungary, with Serbia and Croatia in September, October. The Greek, Turkish, and Bulgarian-Turkish model of land border fortification, established in 2012 and 2013 respectively, moves toward the north. It was conceived and sanctioned also as a way to secure Europe's external borders and resulted in the Aegean option as the only feasible one for Syrian refugees. So in other words, in 2012 and 2013, Greece and Turkey fenced the kind of land border, Greece and Bulgaria fenced the land border with Turkey because there was already evidence that the Syrians were arriving. Regardless of one's politics on this matter and of the pending status of Turkey as a safe country of origin and transit, which legally is a precondition for the readmission of people there, a crucial question remains. Here I am sketching how the global responsibility for refugees remain so unequally distributed. But why is it so? 86% of the world's refugees are hosted in so-called developing countries, but geography is not destiny, as testified by the case of Eritreans arriving in Italy, and Eritrea, by the way, is also a former colony. More than 200,000 Eritrean refugees live in Ethiopia and Sudan. Unstable Sudan, where some of the transnational human smuggling networks originate, has been hosting Eritrean refugees for more than 40 years. As with other protracted refugee situations, durable solutions are limited: local integration, international resettlement, and repatriation. Repatriation is, of course, particularly unlikely for Eritreans in Sudan. New generations are massively leaving the country of Eritrea to avoid mandatory long-term national service when not systematic, widespread, and gross human rights violations, in the UN's words, not my words. Generations of Afghan refugees have also been exposed to the displacement of their youth. As a young Afghan man put it to me, you don't have to suffer violence directly. You often escape the credible threat of either inflicting or suffering violence. There are some 950,000 Afghan refugees in Iran. Journeys take years and are transcontinental, from Afghanistan to the UK, for example, through Iran, Turkey, Greece, and Italy. What are then some of the justifications behind the active perpetuation of such inequality in the global responsibility toward refugees? While politicians such as Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, Viktor Orban, and our very own Italian Matteo Salvini offer nativist, Islamophobic, and conveniently misinformed answers centered on welfare, unemployment, security, and the ostensibly Christian essence of their respective countries and of Europe, their centrist and even liberal counterparts are conspicuously silent. There's no reason why this needs to be this way. Perhaps Eurocentrism does not even need rhetorical justifications. As Europeans, I'm Italian, we simply take it for granted that this is the natural order of things, that it is just normal for post-war and tiny Lebanon to host, however precariously, more than 1 million Syrian refugees, approximately 1 in 3 residents, while it is simply inconceivable that our European ostensible balance of wages, social life, rights, and healthcare might undergo minimal changes because of refugees. We don't even realize that the hierarchy of international relations and of the migratory regime makes substantial portions of our national and EU efforts of so-called partnership and dialogue with transit and origin countries, especially in Africa, amount to an arguably neo-colonial exercise, and also results in the strengthening of the very regimes that, with their less than transparent human rights records, less than transparent since I'm being recorded, contribute substantially to the displacement of their own citizens and to the vulnerability of others in their jurisdiction. Policy perspectives appear to take for granted the difference between unacceptable economic migrants and tentatively deserving asylum seekers and refugees. See the great number of people who feel obliged, who are obliged to declare Syrian origin, even if they are not Syrians. In reality, the right to seek asylum in Europe is being reduced to a discretionary sovereign permission. What needs to be questioned and denaturalized is the European and global political culture of refugee containment and its discursive and material techniques. Arguably, access to an asylum application in the EU and to personal safety in Turkey should not be left to the discretion of a smuggler or to luck with the elements. Both at the discursive political level and empirically, one must ask how persons and groups recognized as in need of protection, of international protection, ought to enter Europe and apply for asylum in the absence of the smugglers who serve as exploitative facilitators for their trip. But again, this might be a rhetorical question, for European sovereign actors actively nurture the already entrenched inequality in the global responsibility toward refugees. And while it is common to hear international and humanitarian actors advocate for governments to do more in helping Syrian refugees, the sovereign reproduction of crisis and of emergency remains largely unchallenged by the emphasis on saving desperate victims and by the declared war on smuggling. For Europe and international actors do much more than merely waiting with indifference prior to occasionally helping refugees. They design and enforce their sovereign architecture with digital and material thresholds, bilateral agreements, air carrier sanctions, contradictory bureaucracies, and unenforceable policies, and then, at best, respond with search and rescue operations. They have Europeanized containment, deterrence, and surveillance, spending billions of euros. In the book, I talk about Eurosur, for example. They have fragmented refugees' European journey into a violently futile succession of national obstacles. Refugees continue to face a domino effect that from north to south has multiplied the often brutal border encounter with what is supposed to be their closest safe haven. Europe's crisis is not caused by migrants and refugees. Rather, the treatment of migrants and refugees signal that Europe is strained by internal inequality, by its fragmented asylum, reception, and integration policies, by the concatenation of borders that generate illegality and violence. We can't help all of them. We cannot take all of them in. It's legitimate to share in these trendy opinions. But those who maintain such positions conveniently fail to better qualify their terms. Who is the we? A tiny Greek island, an Italian neighborhood, a dense city, a depopulated rural town, Italy and Greece, Europe, a homogeneous and segregated society, or societies that are already plural, albeit unequal and arguably non-pluralistic. Who is them? How many people would have the right to seek asylum? Why do they need the services of smugglers? How much does it cost to keep them away? These questions are often preempted. They're not even posited. We can't receive all of them. Well, we are not. Following the deadliest shipwreck ever recorded in April 2015, EU leaders tried to envision a standardized approach toward the relocation of refugees already on EU soil. And even this very minimum objective is utterly failing to materialize. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker was reported as saying, 120,000 refugees to be relocated? We are ridiculous, given the scale of the problem, said Juncker. I wonder if the Lebanese or Jordanians understand what we are talking about. In short, the maritime arrivals of 2015 have made evident the human and financial costs of enforcing the separation between Europe and the Mediterranean. And the course full of obstacles toward northern European cities has confirmed the impracticability not of the Schengen Treaty and of free mobility within Europe, but precisely of the restrictions to free internal mobility. In other words, I've been trying to turn the cultural political discourse and our analysis inside out, hopefully. The separation between Europe and the Mediterranean is neither a natural condition nor an unsurmountable civilizational barrier. It is, rather, an unsustainable status quo that can be perpetuated only at an excruciating cost: human, ethical, financial, geopolitical. The above-mentioned fortification of the land border between Bulgaria and Turkey and Greece and Turkey, contributing to the prevalence of the Aegean route and subsequent shipwrecks, is not natural. And the sea does nothing by itself. The sea does not preclude passage through its straits. It does not dictate immigration policies, delay family reunifications, or impose exorbitant fines to ferries and planes taking refugees to safety. The sea does not sign bilateral agreements, or make development aid conditional upon migration containment. It does not reject people, it does not traffic in persons, nor does it rescue them, even if people are not deterred by the prospect of death. The Mediterranean Sea and its place in Europe will never go back to what it was, regardless of which page in history some might have rested their vision on. The people that we have pushed toward the sea and possibly abandoned there will never reemerge. Critics at this juncture might argue that the mandate of democratically elected governments is to safeguard the safety and rights of their own citizens, rather than of those who knock on the polity's doors. The war on smuggling discourse, the emphasis on so-called desperate victims, and other palliatives and distractions align quite effortlessly with such a nativist perspective that undermines the foundations of the right of asylum. In reality, while palliatives and distractions might constitute a sign of the sovereign fight against international organized crime, they fail to curb unregulated arrivals and organized crime. While they might quell the short-lived outrage cyclically generated by powerful images of Mediterranean carnage, they fail to mitigate Mediterranean carnage. Massive unregulated mobility is already happening, but at an excruciating cost. Can European and other liberal democratic governments act in more rational, just, and proactive ways? International and humanitarian organizations have long proposed a variety of provisions that would mitigate loss of life at sea and help toward refugees' orderly arrival in the EU. Some of these provisions, including family reunifications, study visas, temporary protection, and boosting the staff of asylum adjudication committees, are already part of national and EU legislation, but will need to be more effectively implemented. More ambitiously, planning for realistic labor immigration quotas that actually reflect the needs of the job market and of Europe's aging societies, while protecting existing worker rights, would also be instrumental toward easing asylum committees' enormous workload. In other words, not forcing people to say they are refugees or that they are Syrians, when in reality they might not always be. I have also proposed in another venue a moratorium on air carrier sanctions. In other words, yes, people could be allowed with some qualifications to travel on planes and ferries. Cumulatively, these provisions will make a substantial dent in smugglers' monopoly and contribute toward a more orderly arrival for those needing protection, a more dignified treatment, and a more capillary effort at debriefing and fingerprinting people, as required by EU policies. These are undoubtedly hard times for some European citizens, especially in Southern Europe. Unemployment and emigration are pervasive. But it is precisely in this situation of social and economic precariousness, which has been made structural anyway, that the challenges of migration and the threat of self-radicalization and fanaticism demand investments into the national and European infrastructure of asylum and immigration civil administration, as well as in the psychological, linguistic, social, and religious support to each single person who disembarks in Europe, with special attention to unaccompanied teenagers. Unfortunately, this is all very different from the practices of emergency, spectacle, and informal grey economy that have characterized migrants' reception over the last 2 decades, especially in Italy. At the same time, individual citizens and cultural, athletic, and religious groups are demonstrating that they have an important role in the dignified reception of newcomers. For example, by hosting refugees in their own homes in coordination with local municipalities and police forces, these social actors are showing that there are alternatives to cramming people into centralized hostels. By volunteering and spending their nights at the docks in Greece and Italy, they're saying they do not resent being at the forefront of refugees' reception. This is December 31st, 2014. Happens to be my hometown, 800 Syrians. And quite importantly, a lot of people, police agents, the mayor, were working, and others were on Facebook comfortably and in a warm environment complaining about the refugees. These dynamics, These dynamics of mobilization deserve further analysis, also because their practice confounds one of the main rationales for the current exclusionary system vis-à-vis refugees, Europeans' presumed nativism. From their intimate living quarters and from the public square constituted by docks, motorways, border posts, and railway stations, citizens are demonstrating that they do not resign themselves to their role as gatekeepers, bystanders, or mourners of migrants lost at sea. They are clarifying that chants and policies calling for refugees to go back home are not effected in their name and on their behalf. European societies are undeniably split on migration and refugee issues. Still, one needs to ask why the pervasive reality of nativism summons more attention, policy-wise, if not analytically, than the equally pervasive reality of the civil society and administrative actors working hard to extend a dignified reception and to foster egalitarian integration. This is not to say that there are consensual solutions, easy solutions toward ending the ongoing chronicle of Mediterranean deaths. The Mediterranean is not an idealistic abstraction. It serves as a strategic crossroads for global energy, telecommunication, security, trade, and fishing interests. 30% of worldwide maritime mercantile traffic transits through the Mediterranean. Geopolitically, there is no more room for the Eurocentric idea that the Mediterranean Sea is a European sea. Entrenched contradictions are likely to re-emerge. They were brushed under the carpet of cooperation with authoritarian regimes, such as Ben Ali's Tunisia and Gaddafi's Libya. Italian and other government leaders have historically preoccupied themselves with oil and gas supplies, with military and technology sale contracts, with closing without critical reassessment the black book of colonialism, and with keeping migrants and refugees far from national shores. The asymmetrical relationships between the Tunisian youth and their French and Italian counterparts across the sea, or between Moroccan and Spanish youths, are left unaddressed. During the 2011 Arab uprisings, many European observers confused connectivity with connectedness. They believed that the precarious freedom of expression conquered on public squares and social networks, in Egypt, for example, had somehow replaced the aspiration to unrestricted mobility in the networked Euro-Mediterranean area. In reality, freedoms that Europeans take for granted as rights, to mature by discovering the world, to meet a friend, or to be reunited with family, to work elsewhere. So freedoms that Europeans take for granted as rights remain discretionary permissions for people on the Mediterranean's southern and eastern shores. Accordingly, the analytical grammar describing borders as open or closed is in itself incomplete. It needs to be complemented by additional research questions. For whom and for what is the border open or closed? in which direction, who benefits from specific openings and closings, what is the price, humanitarian, political, and financial, of an exchange that, as historian Franco Cardini puts it, is rooted in the 16th century and allows Europe to, quoting, import labor and raw materials at the prices we establish and export finished products and immaterial values such as freedom and human rights, these too at the prices we establish. So to state the obvious, Italian, Spanish, and multinational companies are not offering a fair pay for the produce they buy in North Africa and transform in Europe. And the same argument can be made about mineral extraction, including French uranium extraction in Niger. There is no stereotypical identity bringing together concerned people around the Mediterranean. There is instead a lived experimentation with the reconfiguration of Mediterranean membership, responsibility, and ownership. This does not negate the multiplicity of the stakes, affiliations, and vantage points of the various actors claiming the sea. On the contrary, the proximity of difference carries with it the potentiality of belonging to a community in which plurality and difference are the norm. Analytically, in the near future and right now also, my forthcoming research questions are not about people belonging to the Mediterranean, but rather about the Mediterranean belonging to its citizens, or more precisely, becoming a more equally shared responsibility. The objective, politically, is for the Mediterranean to become a common and public good without fear of violence, oppression, terrorism, authoritarianism, hunger, and death at sea. National boundaries in such an emerging vision, which obviously is not merely or only my own, national boundaries help coordinate administration and responsibility sharing. As they are not fractures between worlds that are too unequal, they do not need to be securitized through naval blockades, multi-million surveillance programs, or extenuating search and rescue operations. And, as I already suggested, any actor committed to pursuing these objectives needs to grapple with the entrenched hierarchy of existing international and economic relations. As most pupils in Italian schools a few decades ago, I was taught that Mediterranean means the sea amid lands, and that the Romans used to call it Mare Nostrum, our sea. Later, I understood that Italian fascists really liked that phrase too, Mare Nostrum, and tried to make it into a policy objective. But it is the presence, movement, and circulation of people and embodied practices that makes places meaningful, including the Mediterranean. But circulation, when it comes to certain non-citizens, is preempted, intercepted, or pushed back. Circulation is taken hostage south and north of the Mediterranean as geopolitical tensions re-emerge. Profiteers defend their smuggling monopoly, and well-financed terrorism ghastly reinvents itself. Some think the legal, political, symbolic, and physical partition of people and spaces, including at sea, can actually be accomplished, humanely or otherwise, with a handshake between diplomats, with surveillance technology, with conditional development aid, with militaristic discipline, with brutal fanaticism and political terrorism. In reality, as I've come to appreciate, you don't divide up an empire with a handshake. You have to cut it with a knife. This is Roberto Saviano's phrase, not my own. So you don't divide up an empire with a handshake, you have to cut it with a knife. It is only after completing my research that I felt it would serve as a fitting epigraph for Crimes of Peace, my book. Even if Saviano is talking about drug trafficking and organized crime, while I'm talking about sovereignty and organized crime. And drawing on Crimes of Peace, I'm going to share some final thoughts for your consideration. The drowned and the saved. their families, their pro bono lawyers, fishermen, activists, sailors, investigative reporters, judges, and rescue workers are writing many pages of the social history of this Euro-Mediterranean present. Which Europe do I want to live in? Which legacy do we want to leave? We can make the Mediterranean into a Mare Nostrum, our sea, by further privatizing it, thus taking advantage of the ensuing privileges and inequalities. But in doing so, we risk also privatizing us, under siege, in a bastion of crumbling self-sufficiency and angst. So-called great teacher and soul force Enver Hoxha, the infamous Albanian leader, colonized every corner of the public sphere with mobile defensive bunkers. And this is actually not in Albania, it's in Lampedusa from World War II. That was Enver Hoxha's autarkic vision of liberty and security. Or we could demand something else daily, with our examples, votes, relationships, acts of disobedience, and by affording scholarly and public resonance to already existing social engagements and policy alternatives. We could demand that the fact that migrants and refugees do not intend to stay in Italy or Greece be appreciated as a socio-economic warning about the plight of these countries, rather than proclaim with relief, oh, they don't want to stay here, great. We may demand that European social insecurity be addressed through more just social and labor relations, rather than through the creative use of digital barbed wire, the costly technocracy of austerity, and always fashionable scapegoating. That political disaffection be addressed through more honest and grounded politics, rather than through the infantilization of citizens and the populism of self-anointed saviors. That the Italian South offset the prospects of the so-called human and industrial desertification, which is related to sustained emigration and structural impoverishment. The Italian, Europe-Mediterranean and post-colonial hierarchical relations between a majority of people put in the position of needing salvation and an elite of saviors, and between South and North, be redressed with daily pragmatism and sustainable politics of justice, rather than reproduced by predatory paternalism and moralizing racism. The migrants' queries be addressed with rights, respect, and justice, rather than with permissions, spectacle, and emergency. I'm inclined to believe some of these initiatives require more accountability in public funds allocations and a redistribution of spending. Without any additional funding or spending, for example, authorities may also decide whether prejudice, discrimination, and Islamophobia need to be tolerated or prosecuted. Assess whether funds for integration can be allocated more transparently. Understand whether the diffusion of critical and active citizenship is an unwarranted ball and chain for governments, or rather, the most crucial form of capital for the survival of any modern liberal democracy. This ongoing crisis of sovereignty and of humanitarianism could have constituted an opportunity for larger critical reassessment, as the word crisis could suggest. Nevertheless, while even the European Commission itself acknowledged that smuggling networks can be weakened only if safe and legal ways into the EU are made available, the outrage and the institutional mourning generated by major or otherwise conspicuous shipwrecks are cyclically disciplined into the strengthening of national and EU preemptive approaches toward controlling migration. Not too long ago, in September 2015, observers shed tears for little Alan Kurdi, lying still on the Turkish beach of Bodrum. Within 24 hours of the photos, Alan Kurdi's photos' viral circulation, charities working in the Mediterranean and with refugees saw donations skyrocket from everywhere. Ink was spilled on the power of images, on the appropriateness of publishing the child's image, and on its moral and political potential. People stared uncomfortably at the graceful piety of the tall police officer, and of Alan's sleep in his arms. But this is not Michelangelo's Pietà. There's no easy, popular, and political redemption, especially when one acknowledges the many deaths following Alan's death, even in the exact same stretch of the Aegean. But are citizens helping out newcomers and policymakers working on innovative provisions? Are they challenging themselves and their certainties in interacting with and thinking about people who are routinely described and perceived as either vulnerable and passive subjects in need of salvation, or as disruptive social, economic, religious, and security threats? If not, if there is not critical reassessment and doing something, we really have no more excuses for using the word crisis. We are witnessing conspicuous mobilization in tiny Greek islands, in Greek, Italian, Turkish, and even Libyan ports, at fenced, mined, and muddy buffer zones, at border posts, including between Italy and France and in southeastern Europe, along the motorway between Hungary and Austria, in railway stations throughout southeastern European countries, as well as in Italy and Germany. Among the things I've learned in this scholarly journey is that in small coastal locations, as in larger cities, social actors, including citizens, refugees, and so-called second generations, are actively demonstrating to administrators and others in the polity that the substance of rights, of human rights, is integral to the substance of democracy, that there is more to politics than a club consultation and the ratification of purported consensus. And what I'm saying, it's okay to be partisan sometime. This was from this past summer in Rome. Many people are laboring to reconfigure the outposts of European exclusion and salvation into nodes of a more just Euro-Mediterranean network. But the Euro-Mediterranean network exists only insofar as it is navigated. And this is Lampedusa. Mare Nostrum, I was saying, our sea, also known as the Great Sea, the Middle Sea, the White Sea in other languages. It belongs to all and to no one. And Mediterraneo, a sea amid lands, as Italian pupils routinely learn. But my wonderfully strict teacher might have been wrong. Plus, I was only a child. The sea being amid lands is not the point. Perhaps the emphasis needs to be on Europe as a land amid seas. At least, this is how Mediterranean seafarers are recharting Europe, precisely as a land amid seas. Thank you.
Will you field your own questions? Would you like me to stand up and...
No, it's okay. I can do this.
Okay, okay. Questions?
So, thank you, first of all. It's very complex history and chronology of what happened earlier. And something that's both in the technocratic, Eurocentric rhetoric of the European contest Europe itself. So to create a different kind of effective relationship with us versus them, where Europe is seeking to defend, it's the fortune that is at risk of being attacked by the enemies, but also is wrong, utterly wrong in its sort of statist and bureaucratic organization that has to be dismantled, and everything is also goes around with the euro financial issue. So I was thinking if you considered how, or if you would like to comment how the two effective links work in terms of then, the public, the success of these two rhetorics in public perception. How, we have marches and rallies then deploys this rhetoric in very different ways and with very different endings, but at the end they kind of have the same effect of leaving people out, or in some way increasing heating the debate and the hate towards violence.
Thank you for your question. Well, I kind of, hinted at this a little bit. So the more, right-wing populist kind of political actors give us some reasons, as wrong or incorrect or misinformed as they are. They provide some, supposed reasons for why supposedly there's no alternative, why we need to, to keep doing what we're doing in terms of, how we understand sovereignty and, this kind of possessive ownership of territory and of, seascapes and cities and all that. But the technocrats, the EU, commissioners, and our, in much of Europe, either centrist or kind of even progressive governments, are not really giving any reason. They're just quiet. And so when you're quiet and when you're just pretending that there is that, a cultural consensus and that this is just normal, well, pretty obviously what you're doing is, lending some credit to what people more on your right are saying. And I could answer with so many layers, but of course also when there's, it's kind of proven when there is economic downturn and unemployment, anti-immigrant sentiments go up, and it's always, of course, there's the issue of the complexity. It took me kind of 50 minutes and 200 pages, to say these kind of things, and how snappier and more effective and productive and and catchy is it to come out with a Twitter something or to post on Facebook. And when you compare what I was saying about that night in my own hometown, the people working there all night and making an effort, and the others, how long does it take to just post something on Facebook of xenophobic, Islamophobic nature and have whatever how many likes you collect. So there is that too, and some I don't feel in response also to this kind of question, once again, as a social scientist and somebody who's knowledgeable, then okay, what is our role in at a very basic level, clarifying, rectifying misinformation about all of this.
I'm thinking about sort of Europe and the Mediterranean and the way in which the nations that border the Mediterranean are marginal in Europe, both geographically but also in many other ways. And we saw Greece face its own crisis this summer, for which it needed sort of EU intervention, and Europe was also for a time uninterested in providing that aid. I
Yeah, it's another wonderful and huge question. So, in theory, prior to this summer, for those of you who know, the Dublin regulation, so it's a kind of pan-European Union regulation. So, in whatever kind of border country, so it could be Poland in the north, with Ukrainian refugees, for example, or Spain from Morocco. So, external border countries are supposed to process, identify, and detain people, usually for a period of time, and that's not really happening. Or, again, as I said, everyone wants that to happen, but it's very difficult to enforce. So that kind of question has re-emerged in the political landscape, because I've heard some Italian politicians, kind of moderate, not particularly anti-European, saying, okay, they kind of blaming again European authorities, but maybe there is a point in that. So saying, okay, they're gonna probably come up with a different currency for Southern Europe. They're coming up with a more with a core group of Schengen countries, right? And so you have Schengen in Northern Europe, and then Italy and Greece kind of on their own kind of thing, and Southeastern Europe. And so I think there is a sense. I mean, in Italy and in the book, there for years there has been a sense of, this is not just a an Italian problem. It's not just a Greek problem. But I feel it's only been, a little bit during the Arab uprisings with the arrival of Tunisians in particular, and Tunisians do want to go to France often, and so France kind of started to understand that, okay, this is not just about Italy. And now, Germany and Sweden and everyone realize. And so there is that appreciation, but in terms of policies and what we are likely to see in the near future, I'm afraid it's going to be more of those, kind of Chinese boxes or Russian dolls or something of, this kind of proliferation of borders, both could be financial and actual physical fences, and that doesn't look particularly, nice from Southern Europe, but analytically, that's arguably going to contribute to further, structural kind of poverty of these countries, and to more inequality within Europe, and to further, I would call it structural violence, the migrants and refugees have to face in Europe. Thank you. Yes?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I really look forward to reading your book, right? So one thing that struck me, so you started, right, this talk by saying how this guy, I forgot his name, of course, but so he didn't cross the border, or crossed the border, right? I was, maybe hoping, right, to hear, so what else are these people saying? I mean, it's a silly question,
yeah.
But, like, we talk so much about, we don't want to think of it as a crisis, of course, even though, the term crisis, right, has this very interesting etymology and so on and so forth. But we do look for solutions, and your talk is obviously a plea, a moving plea, right, for some kind of solution. So if it's not a crisis, maybe it doesn't have a solution in way either, right? I mean, it's just such an intractable paradox or condition of tension or whatever it is. So what do you think an anthropologist, right, as opposed to somebody else, right, a historian or a political scientist, what can an anthropologist like yourself, right, contribute to this?
Yeah.
I don't know if you know what I'm saying, right?
Of course, yeah. I've written an article because I was kind of tormented or tormenting myself with the kind of question. So very easy answer is to say doing what we do best, or what we should be doing, which is considering the whole person. So, what are the implications in terms of human rights when you consider the whole person and the individual in its, kind of reality and plausibility, rather than, the stereotypical statistic, or, but it's a bit more nuanced than that, because, okay, if you take seriously this idea of the person, the anthropologists and others kind of share into, well, a person does not just need food and shelter, right? They also need civil, political rights, belonging, social capital, assistance, and all of that. So, but even at a more, like in terms of basic research, as I was saying earlier, redressing some of the information and or misinformation and some of these, confusions. A lot of people don't really understand the difference between. I problematize the difference, of course, between refugees and economic migrants, but a lot of people don't know that there are differences, at least legally, or at least in theory, because then in practice it's a longer story. A little bit, I understand, but I not working knowledge. It's a good point. Well, people understand themselves in different ways, and going back to, and so to conclude, first part of the answer is, of course, again, to redress, to share whatever we know with students, with larger audiences, larger publics. Although I am convinced that politicians kind of know already what's going on, and there's not really that much merit in informing politicians, because again, I am convinced that they know what they're doing. Even if it looks like they are clueless, which they are, but they know the negative consequences of what they're doing. So then the second part of the answer, more specifically as an anthropologist, is not to kind of discount or dismiss or kind of bracket out our relations, the relations that we build along, with people, the sensory, this kind of stuff I mentioned earlier, the kind of physiological and psychological and interpersonal and emotional things to which we are exposed, which is a very small and tiny, fragment of what these people are exposed or expose themselves to. And so how do you convey that, right, in a way that is not just sex and drugs and death and sensationalistic, in a way that is honest and I have to believe that being honest and clear about the people we meet and what happens to them, or what do they do actively in terms of agency, might have some sort of effect, or might at least resonate with people. And so hopefully it's like, okay, half of the job is the anthropologist, but then the other half is readers, voters, journalists. Thank you. Yes.
Two questions. First, what's the name of the article? You said his question, something you talked about.
Yeah. Yeah.
The name of the article would be awesome. And then second, maybe the opposite question, Brian or Albert. Have you thought of I'm interested to hear your thoughts about your research in comparison to other places. For example, U.S.-Mexico border. I work in Burma, Muslim population, so the Bay of Bengal, a lot of what you're saying is I'd be interested in your thoughts on comparison to other places, or maybe we can say comparison to patterns that are global, that are not just on the U.S.-Mexico border, the Bay of Bengal, Mediterranean, but maybe changes into the way that things like refugee law are beginning to be understood.
Yeah. Thank you. Name of the article, it is in press, so it's going to be a while, though. I believe it is, the journal is going to be Anthropological Quarterly, titled Mediterranean Carnage. Yeah. Public Scholarship and Public Citizenship and Heretical Scholarship in an Age of Eloquence. So we gotta say something, I guess, in an age of eloquence as scholars. So, and second part of the question, borders. You know, in the book, I talk about borders as this kind of a multivariate, kind of a almost interactive, you know, process or mechanism in the sense of. Sure, of course, you know, these are separate things, US, Mexico, Southeastern Europe or South Asia, the Pacific, etc. But to a degree, it's kind of part of a system. And so, you know, all the way back in Sudan has something to do and is interconnected with Egypt and right now, you know, Mauritania, since Algeria, as I mentioned, kind of close its kind of door to Syrian refugees. It's not like huge, but a few, you know, dozens or hundreds are flying down to Mauritania and then hoping to get, you know, to Ceuta and Melilla, so Spain within Morocco, or possibly Libya and Italy. So, you know, obviously there are. I mean, there are, of course, some, I guess, similarities. You know, you often see, especially in the U.S.-Mexico case and U.S.-Central America, you see, you know, a hierarchy that it's there, and sometimes I find myself thinking how unlucky, I'm still being recorded, how unlucky is Mexico to have, you know, us as their neighbors, not because we are bad, but simply because of the inequality. And, you know, I'm also confident I can say, to say that fence, border, you know, whatever we want to do in Europe, which is probably along those lines, is only likely to make it worse. And so, you know, there are, so if that's going to be the approach, you know, I have really no reason to be, you know, optimistic, because today Syria, you know, tomorrow could be another country. Last summer it was the unaccompanied, you know, Central American minors, and the response, as always, is, you know, detention, removal, isolation. So, you know, there are a lot of estimates about, you know, the future of refugee movements, and in particular the idea of environmental refugees, right? Especially in Asia. And I'm thinking, you know, if right now it's such a fuss and kind of chaos for 1 million people, I mean, not all, but mostly Syrians, whom, you know, it's so obvious, and it's already part of the kind of legal system that Europe and everyone else should be, you know, receiving or at least assessing their, you know, asylum claims. What's going to happen when, you know, it's a bit less obvious that people are refugees, you know, including environmental refugees? And one more qualification is that while, again, much of the literature, the kind of anthropological and, you know, social scientific literature is critical because of the stories, you know, that we hear. It's critical of the dichotomy, you know, black and white, but or mutually exclusive, you know, economic, migrant and refugee, or forced and voluntary. So, you know, overall we are critical. I know that people are, like, activists and human rights lawyers are very worried by this trend. You know, they do want to preserve a neat difference and kind of a clear categorization between refugees and economic immigrants. And I know of people who have dedicated, you know, 40 years of their lives and careers working with refugees and kind of human rights law, and once again, not being comfortable with the fact that Syrians have to kind of compete with Afghanis or Iraqis or the other way around. So that's I don't think there is a plan being envisioned for okay, how do we deal with refugees in 20 years, and this is only proof what's going on right now, that we can't quite deal with what is going on now even.
With that, I should say parenthetically that there is, have you ever heard the saying, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to everybody else, or so far from God and so close to the United States? You don't even have to say it yourself, you don't have to take responsibility for it, you can just quote him. With that, I think we need to wrap it up because we need to get the room closed. So let's thank Fabrizio one more time for one.
No, thank you.